There is a shoebox in a closet in America right now with a decade of somebody's life in it. Concert ticket stubs, a Walkman with the foam pads gone, a stack of photographs nobody has scanned. And somewhere near the bottom, under all of it, is a watch with a dead battery and a perished rubber strap that somebody wore every day in 1987 and hasn't touched since. It looks like nothing. It looks specifically like the kind of thing you throw away without a second thought, because everybody knows the 80s was the decade watches got cheap and plastic and disposable. And that assumption is why the single most valuable object in that closet can end up in a garbage bag. The difference between the 80s watch worth nothing and the 80s watch worth $30,000 is almost never how expensive it looked. It comes down to a short string of numbers on the back of the case and a very specific window of years. 9 watches, 1 habit. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which 80s watches to hunt for in closets, drawers, and estate sale boxes. Why the ones that look most disposable are frequently the ones collectors fight hardest over, and roughly what each one is bringing in today's market. Before the list, build the habit, because everything here depends on it. Turn the watch over and find the reference number. Not the serial number, the reference number, which identifies the exact model rather than the exact watch. On most Swiss watches, it's stamped between the lugs where the strap attaches, and you may need to remove the strap to see it. On Japanese watches, it's usually printed right on the case back in plain sight. That number is everything in this decade, more than in any other. And here's why. The 80s was a period of rapid transition. Manufacturers were changing crystals, dials, movements, and case designs constantly, sometimes within a single production run, and collectors have since sorted those variations into a hierarchy where one version can be worth 5 times another version that looks identical from 2 feet away. Without the reference number, you're describing a generic old watch. With it, you're describing exactly the thing somebody has been searching for. And then there's the second habit, which is specific to this decade and which costs people the most. Do not throw away a watch because the battery is dead, the strap has crumbled, or the display is blank. Quartz watches from this era are frequently perfectly functional and simply need a battery. Rubber and resin straps from the 80s degrade, get sticky, go chalky, and fall apart, and that is expected, not a defect. In several cases on this list, the watch is worth far more than a working modern one precisely because it was put away and forgotten instead of worn to death. One more piece of context that explains this entire list. In the 70s, cheap quartz destroyed the mechanical watch industry, and the 80s was the aftermath. Swiss brands were fighting for survival, some collapsing entirely, and the ones that survived did strange, experimental, sometimes desperate things to stay alive. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers, having won, started pushing technology forward aggressively. The result is a decade of watches that nobody took seriously at the time, made in relatively small numbers because nobody was buying, and thrown away in enormous quantities because they looked cheap. That combination, low production plus high attrition, is the exact recipe that creates scarcity 30 years later. So let's go through it properly. Number 9, the Tudor Submariner. We start with the brand that spent 40 years being treated as the consolation prize. Tudor was Rolex's more affordable sister company, using Rolex cases and Rolex bracelets with outsourced movements inside. And for decades, the watch world's attitude was that if you couldn't afford a real Rolex, you bought one of these. That attitude collapsed completely over the last 15 years. 80s Tudor Submariners now trade in the $6,000 to $7,000 range, and the earlier snowflake-handled versions sit right around there too, with exceptional examples going higher. Here's what to check. Look at the dial for the Tudor name with a rose or a shield logo, and look at whether the hour hand ends in a square rather than a circle, which is the detail collectors call the snowflake. Look at the bracelet clasp, because it will often say Rolex on it even though the dial says Tudor, and that combination confuses people into thinking the watch is a fake. It isn't. That's how they were built. If somebody in your family bought a dive watch in the 80s because a Submariner was out of reach, that compromise may have aged extremely well. Number 8. The Casio G-Shock DW5000C. Now the one that will genuinely surprise people, because it's a $50 plastic digital watch, and it is on this list legitimately. In the early 80s, a Casio engineer named Kikuo Ibe dropped a watch his father had given him and watched it shatter on the pavement. That became an obsession, and he set himself a goal his colleagues called Triple 10, a watch that could survive a 10-meter fall, resist 10 bar of water pressure, and run 10 years on one battery. After roughly 200 failed prototypes, many of them dropped out of a third-floor bathroom window at Casio's research building. His team solved it with a hollow internal structure that suspended the module inside the case like a yolk floating in an egg. The result, launched in April 1983 as the DW5000C, the first G-Shock, and the line has since sold over 100 million units. Now the values? A working original with a replacement band runs roughly $500 to $1,000. Good original condition sits in the $2,000 to $5,000 range. And genuinely unworn dead stock with its packaging has been valued at $10,000 to $20,000 and up. A full set example sold recently for just under $2,000. Check the case back for the DW5000C designation and Module 240 and understand the catch. The resin degrades, so most survivors have replacement parts, and intact original resin is the entire game. Number 7. The Seiko 7A28 designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro. This one hides behind looking like a toy from a school lunchbox. Angular, asymmetric, often black-coated, with a strange offset case and colored pushers. In 1982, Seiko commissioned the Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro, a man best known for designing cars, to produce a watch, and what he delivered was one of the most aggressively futuristic objects of the decade. Underneath it was the caliber 7A28, the world's first analog quartz chronograph movement, built entirely of metal parts including the rotors, and considered by many to be among the finest quartz chronograph movements ever produced. Then in 1986, James Cameron put these watches on the cast of Aliens, and the reference 7A28-7000 ended up on Sigourney Weaver's wrist as Ellen Ripley. Collectors have called it the Ripley ever since. Ordinary 7A28 references trade in the $400 to $500 range. The Ripley reference specifically has been listed in the $900 to $2,600 range depending on condition and originality. Look for a Seiko with a case that isn't round, isn't symmetrical, and looks like it belongs on a spaceship. Then read the reference off the back. Number 6. The Rolex Sea Dweller, 16,660. Everyone hunts for vintage submariners. Almost nobody thinks about the Sea Dweller, which is the same idea built for saturation divers, and that gap is the opportunity. The 16,660, nicknamed the 666 for obvious reasons, was Rolex's transitional Sea Dweller, and it carries a genuinely strange origin story. During the U.S. Navy Sea Lab experiments in the 60s, divers living in pressurized underwater habitats found that the breathing gas mixture was seeping into their watches, and during decompression it would expand until the crystal blew clean off the case. Rolex's answer was a valve on the side of the case that lets helium escape safely. That's the single easiest identifier here. Look at the left side of the case for a small round protrusion at roughly 9 o'clock. If it's there and there's no magnifying bubble over the date, you're looking at a Sea Dweller, not a submariner. These trade around $10,500 in the current market, and unpolished early matte dial examples do considerably better. A Sea Dweller was always the less glamorous choice, which is exactly why fewer were made. We're at the halfway mark, and I want you to notice what's already happened, because it explains the 4 still to come. A Tudor that was the cheaper option, a plastic Casio, a Seiko that looks like a toy, a Rolex that was the unglamorous cousin. Not one of these was the aspirational purchase in its category at the time. Every single one of them was somebody's practical, sensible, slightly compromised choice, and that's precisely why they were used hard, thrown out, and are scarce now. Number 5. The Rolex Explorer 216550. This is where a manufacturing defect made people rich, and it's my favorite story on this list. The Explorer 2 reference 16550 ran only from around 1984 to 1989, a short window, and it was Rolex's transitional model. The first Explorer 2 with a sapphire crystal and a movement allowing the hour hand to be set independently. It came in 2 dials, black and white. The white one was called Polar, and here's the thing, on a portion of those white dials, the paint was defective. Over the following decades, those dials aged from white to a warm, creamy ivory, a flaw, a factory mistake. Collectors now specifically hunt the mistake, and the aged dials command a substantial premium over the correct ones. There's a second detail stacked on top, which collectors call the rail dial. On some examples, the printed text on the lower dial lines up perfectly, letter above letter, between the 2 lines. Get both features together, cream and rail, and you're in serious territory. Asking prices for cream rail dial examples have run north of $24,000, with some listings considerably above that. 2 watches, same reference, same year, and the one that aged wrong is worth multiples of the one that stayed white. Number 4. The Omega Speedmaster Moon Phase, Reference 3450809. Here's an 80s watch that failed commercially and became valuable specifically because it failed. In late 1985, Omega took the Speedmaster Professional, the watch that went to the moon, and added a fourth subdial at 12 o'clock showing the phase of the moon and the date. It was the most complicated Speedmaster made up to that point, and it was priced at least 40% above the standard model, making it the most expensive steel Speedmaster Professional Omega had ever sold. It sold badly. Over the roughly 3 years it was offered, fewer than 1,300 were made, and around 15% of those went out on straps rather than bracelets, mostly to Mexico and Italy. So there are roughly 1,100 bracelet examples in the world. Good condition bracelet examples with box and papers have been guided in the 15 to 16,000 pound range, and strap versions run at least 30% lower. The identifier is unmistakable. A Speedmaster with 4 subdials instead of 3, with the extra one at the top showing a moon against a blue sky. If somebody in the family bought an expensive Omega in the mid-80s and thought it looked fussy, that fussiness was the point. Number 3. The Rolex Daytona 16520. The Daytona is the most famous chronograph in the world, and the 80s version is a specific reference with a specific story. In 1988, Rolex launched the 16520, the first automatic Daytona, and the movement inside it wasn't Rolex's own. It was Zenith's El Primero, the high-frequency automatic chronograph movement from 1969, modified by Rolex, with roughly 200 changes including slowing the frequency down to extend the power reserve. That's why collectors call this generation the Zenith Daytona. It was made from 1988 until 2000, and demand was so far ahead of supply at launch that the waiting list ran to years. Current market standard black or white dial examples in good condition run from the mid-20,000s, with unworn late production full sets reaching the high 30,000s. And then there's the variation collectors chase hardest. On black dial examples from the early through mid-90s, the varnish Rolex used caused the rings around the subdials to oxidize and turn brown. Named the Patrizzi dial after the auctioneer who first identified it, that discoloration is not treated as damage. It regularly trades in the $35,000 to $50,000 range, and porcelain dials, inverted 6 dials, and early Mark I examples in unpolished condition can reach 6 figures at auction. Number 2. The Patek Philippe Nautilus. Now we get to the watch that looks, to an ordinary person, like a slightly odd steel sports watch, and which is one of the most valuable production watches on Earth. The Nautilus arrived in 1976 with a case shaped like a ship's porthole and a price of $3,100, which was extraordinary for a steel watch and comparable to the company's gold dress watches. People thought it was absurd. In 1981, Patek introduced the smaller reference 3800, a 37.5mm version made in a much wider range of materials than the original, and 80s examples turn up in steel, in gold, and in two-tone. Well-preserved 80s and 90s Nautilus examples start from around $34,000. Early 3,700 jumbos run between roughly $142,000 and $213,000. And to show how far provenance can push it, a 3,800 double signed by the London retailer Asprey sold at Philippe in Geneva in 2022 for the equivalent of about €127,000. The identifier is the case shape, a rounded rectangle with 2 hinge-like protrusions on the sides, and a horizontally grooved dial. And number 1, the watch at the very top of this list, the Swatch. I know exactly how that sounds. Stay with me, because this is the most extraordinary thing on this list by a distance. Swatch launched in 1983 as a plastic, sealed, unrepairable, deliberately disposable Swiss watch, and it saved the Swiss watch industry by beating quartz at its own game. Millions were sold. There is almost certainly one in a box in your house, and the vast majority of them are worth what you'd expect, which is very little. But Swatch did something unusual. It commissioned artists. In 1985, at an art exhibition in Paris, Swatch launched a model designed by the French artist Christian Chapiron, who worked under the name Kiki Picasso. Production was declared at 140 pieces, each with a different dial. The face is a chaotic abstract design, and the internal discs rotate so the pattern changes daily, realigning perfectly only every 435th day. In 1989, one sold at Sotheby's in Milan for $45,000, which stands as a world record for a Swatch at auction. Private sales since have run in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. Other artist swatches carry real money too. A jellyfish model from the same 1985 collection has sold for over $10,000, and Keith Haring designs from that era trade in the hundreds to low thousands. A plastic watch that cost about the same as a pizza is the #1 entry on this list, and it deserves to be. So what connects all 9? Every single one was made during the period when the watch industry believed the watch was finished. Mechanical watchmaking was supposed to be dead. Watches were supposed to become disposable electronics. So brands either experimented wildly, produced in small numbers because nobody was buying, or made things people didn't want at the time. And the objects that come out of a period like that, when they survive at all, are exactly what collectors want 30 years later. Run back through those 9 and notice how each one hides. The Tudor hides behind having been the cheaper choice. The G-Shock hides behind being plastic. The Seiko Giugiaro hides behind looking like a toy. The Sea Dweller hides behind resembling a submariner. The Explorer 2 hides behind a dial that looks faded and wrong. The Speedmaster Moonphase hides behind having been a commercial flop. The Zenith Daytona hides behind subdials that look stained. The Nautilus hides behind being steel when everybody expects gold. And the Swatch hides behind being unmistakably a Swatch. 9 different disguises, and every one comes off the same way, by turning the watch over and reading the number. Now let me be completely honest with you, because that's the only reason a channel like this is worth watching. The overwhelming majority of 80s watches are worth very little, and I'd be lying if I let you finish this video thinking otherwise. Ordinary quartz dress watches from this decade, in almost any brand name, are common and typically sell for tens of dollars. Even within these 9 names, the values I've quoted attach to specific references, specific dial variants, and specific conditions, not to the model line generally. Condition punishes this era hard. Polished cases, refinished dials, replacement hands, and degraded resin all cut deeply into value. And on the digital and quartz entries, battery leakage inside the case can be terminal. There is also a serious counterfeit problem at the top of this market, and the 80s references in particular are frequently assembled from mismatched parts. The figures here are market ranges and reported sales, not an appraisal of anything you own. If you think you have something significant, take it to a specialist dealer or an auction house before you sell it to the first buyer who offers. But here's the arithmetic that makes it worth doing anyway. Opening the box, picking up the watch, and reading the back costs you nothing. A few minutes, decent light, and your phone camera zoomed in. Selling a cream dial Explorer 2 at a garage sale for $40 because the dial looked yellowed and the seller assumed it was ruined cost you everything that watch was actually worth. So before another box goes to a donation bin, an estate sale table, or a scrap buyer, go through every closet, every drawer, and every shoebox, and turn over every watch you find. Tell me in the comments which of these 9 turned up in your own house, and if you can read a reference number off the back, put it in there too. I read every comment on these videos, and whatever else you do this week, don't let a single watch leave that house until you've looked at the back of it.